So, it looks like we've received a new peace plan for Ukraine. Now, why do I do this? Well, because to many, including myself, this is nothing more than a rehash of three, four, perhaps five previous iterations of the same peace proposal with the same demands. Maximalist demands by Moscow, effective capitulation by Ukraine, and for both Europe and Ukraine, being entirely excluded in the discussions by their primary ally, the United States. So you might be wondering then, why on earth are you making a video about it? Well, apart from the opportunity to effectively rant in a posh British accent, the plan does reveal some interesting details on, say, Donald Trump's internal politics, the Kremlin's, but also the future of the conflict in a way that the plan perhaps didn't intend to. Perhaps the fact that it was actually leaked instead of being officially released, or perhaps that it's again being incredibly arbitrarily written, drafted by people with no diplomatic or law backgrounds, slanting heavily towards Russia yet again, and also offers therefore a much clearer than ever clarity for the European heart of NATO, Ukraine's future and coexistence with Russia. So in this video, I wanted to break down exactly what this so-called 28-point plan actually says. It's a mirroring of the Gaza plan, for example, why it matters still to an extent, and how, despite what you might think, there are a few key reasons that could make this time a little bit different and for the future of the war.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where we look at the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, and economic statecraft, with a particular emphasis on the Russo-Ukrainian war, and of course now the infamous new peace plan. Now, I won't lie, when the news of this first broke or was leaked yesterday, I rather quickly dismissed it, focusing instead to create a video on the provocations of the Russians on the waters of the British Isles, something that you should definitely check out if you haven't already, because it demonstrates that the Russians are continuing to seek ways to provoke or probe NATO's response across the whole of Europe. But this, of course, after reading it, has demonstrated that the peace plan is a little bit different to other ones. Over the past few days, we've gone from rumour to leaks to now having an actual copy of this draft proposal that Trump's associates have been preparing. Sources say the plan started off as a small improvised document drafted by Wittkott and Dmitriev, the respective envoys of the United States and Russia. But as people around Trump saw it, pushback increased, allegedly including Ukrainians who were privately consulted. That's when Russia's envoy Dmitriev reportedly leaked the proposal to force it into the public sphere and give it a sense of inevitability. And in a way, it has worked. Suddenly the media are treating this as something serious, something in play, even though Russia itself has not been consulted and was apparently even blindsided by the leak. What we now have is a plan that wasn't coordinated with Kiev, wasn't coordinated with Moscow, and is nowhere near developed enough to be presented as a fait accompli, if you mean. Yet, because it's public, both sides are having to respond. With all that in mind, before I go on, what do you think about this? Of course, I know most of you will largely dismiss it as irrelevant, but some of the details, if you look at some of them, which I will come to each individual point briefly throughout this video, which I encourage you to stick around to watch the whole of it, we'll see it is slightly different. But let me know in the comments below what you think. Now, before getting to the points, I'm going to be blunt. My raw opinions are that, well, lots of people are understandably concerned about this new peace plan, but I'm not. And largely because some of the reasons that I will just share bluntly now, but weave into addressing some of the key points as we go on. Firstly, the United States no longer has really any meaningful leverage over the Ukrainians, you could argue. Washington has dramatically reduced its aid already. That weakens its ability to leverage pressure on Kiev, not strengthen it. Any plan built an assumption that the US can strong-arm Ukraine is therefore beginning to start from a false premise. Second, the Kremlin's behaviour around this destroys trust. Russia shows no sign whatsoever of behaving in good faith. It continues actions that give Ukraine zero reason to accept any deal shaped around Russia's preferences, including, obviously, every day that we see a new peace proposal suggested, and then a couple of days later, latest strikes on Ukrainian cities occurs. And meanwhile, Ukraine is striking into Russia. Ukraine's strategic position, thirdly, is improving. It has inflicted lasting economic damage on Russia, the kind that makes Kiev feel closer to a sense that it can hold out even but longer. And with the growing support of Europe, independent of America, everything that has a lag time effect, well, it doesn't feel the need necessarily to have to capitulate. Fourthly, the US doesn't credibly offer security guarantees outside of NATO. Ukraine has tried that. The 1990 guarantees given in exchange for Kiev giving up its nuclear weapons, the Budapest Memorandum, turned out to be worthless. Ukraine is not going to fall for those promises again, especially ones that exclude Europe and even NATO membership. For all those reasons, it is highly unlikely, therefore, these proposals will go anywhere. But something has changed. Ukraine is more adept at playing this diplomatic game the US now puts in front of it, or specifically the Trump administration. They will engage in this process. We've seen Zelensky saying this at the time of recording today, but they're not going to sign anything that undermines their sovereignty. And I think the video can be summarized in this whole event, and well, maybe I'll cover it in a few subsequent videos next week, but it could be summarized as insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and somehow expecting different results. That's very much what we're engaging in now. But let's get to the plan itself. So firstly, intent versus reality. The first thing to understand is this. The plan tries to package Ukraine's concessions as compromises, whilst presenting Russia's demands as immovable facts. Those are not equatable things. At the heart of the document are three main themes. One, territory, basically mirroring a Russian wish list, the maximalist demands Putin has always pushed for. Second, Ukraine's security neutrality, including limits on its military and blocking all of any entirety of NATO membership. A reconstruction package, thirdly, that partly is funded by frozen Russian assets, but Moscow, I know, inevitably will reject outright. So those who hash this together appear to be trying to create something that looks balanced. They offer Ukraine security guarantees, reconstruction funds, and, interestingly, EU access. But the biggest concessions and the most irreversible are all on Ukraine's side. Even then, though, it's unlikely the Russians will be happy. Several clauses dilute Moscow's ambitions or are so vaguely worded they raise new problems. Structurally, the whole plan is contradictory, legally incoherent, and riddled with provisions that create more questions than answers. How tangibly are you going to implement some of these ideas? If a coalition of the willing is not allowed in Ukraine, how on earth is Ukraine going to ensure its security and protection against the Russians if they're able to continue to mobilize on whatever Ukraine's supposed new borders are? It's not feasible unless some actual tangible, conceivable, pragmatic substance is added to the random wording that has been incorporated into this document. Okay, so now let's get to the plan. Below is a breakdown of the most important and problematic points. Number one, Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. Okay, it sounds nice in principle, but it's broad, it's vague, and it's relatively meaningless without territorial clarity. Over what territorial boundaries are we talking about? 1991, the current borderlines, 1921, lacks substance. Points 2 to 4 about non-aggression, NATO dialogue, and US mediation. These are filled with aspirational language. Phrases like Russia is expected not to invade, impose no real obligations. The US, quote, mediating between Russia and NATO is structurally impossible because the US is the heart of NATO. It's the structural command center. Fifth, Ukraine's army capped at 600,000, a foreign imposed limit on a sovereign state armed forces. No restriction on Russia's side, by the way. Also, that is a much bigger number than the original one put forward in Russia's version in 2022 of about 80,000. So that is something that, well, is interesting to see how the Russians will respond. Point 6 to 7, Ukraine is barred from NATO, and these are added into the constitution as well as into NATO's treaty. This is at the core of Russia or Putin's longer term strategy to ensure the absolute prevention of NATO's absorption or Ukraine's ascension into the alliance, which, well, it's a handout to Russia. A rather random one. Europe jets are allowed in Poland. This is a confusing addition intended to salvage a no-fly zone mechanism. How exactly does this come across as feasible or allowable to the Trump administration, but not other expectations? The US security guarantees, they come with a price tag. Now, this reflects Trump's transactional worldview. The US provides a guarantee only with compensation. Ukraine loses a guarantee if it invades Russia. Russia loses all benefits if it invades Ukraine, including all sanctions reimposed on it. Some of these provisions bizarrely go further than NATO's Article 5, basically saying that if Russia does something, then the US will actively and unquestionably kinetically respond, which is more than what Article 5 states. Ukraine can join the EU. Now, historically, the Russians have always been more open to the idea of Ukraine joining the EU, not NATO, because it's an economic bloc, not a military alliance. But ultimately, this is for the EU to decide, not Russia or the United States. Irrelevant point regards reconstruction packages. Now, this is something I could talk to firsthand because I've worked on the main report that has been talking about post-war reconstruction. But this includes a Ukraine Development Fund, a joint US-Ukraine energy infrastructure rebuilding, minerals extraction, a World Bank financing mechanism. Expensive, politically complicated, but positive in principle are the main takeaways I see from this initially. But ultimately, it's transactional again because it bleeds into that deal that Trump was trying to push for greater access to Ukrainian deposits and stuff earlier on in 2025. Russia reintegrates into the global economy. Gradual sanctions relief, US-Russian economic cooperation restored, and an invitation to the G8. Now, Europe and the UK would need to agree, given they have a major say in the G8 and all of this, and that's not going to happen. Continuation of frozen Russian assets. The proposal is basically 100 billion of Russia's assets are invested into Ukraine's reconstruction. Europe adds another 100 billion. Remaining assets go into a US-Russia investment vehicle. Not sure how that would work. Russia will reject this outright. Ukraine will say it's insufficient. The US oddly will keep 50% of the profits. Yeah, no. Moreover, in the report that I worked on, the very minimum, and this was 3 years ago, prior to all the damage that's been done since, the minimum amount to repair Ukraine to a functioning level was 350, 400 billion dollars, upwards of a trillion in some estimations. For context, the entire Marshall Plan of 1948 to rebuild much of Western Europe was $147 billion in modern money. So we're talking at least 3 times, more or less, the minimum to rebuild one country. Russia and the US have some sort of security working group. Ukraine is unsurprisingly excluded, meaning it has no agency in this implementation, and all of this is vague and questionable. Russia codifies non-aggression. It's meaningless without some kind of enforcement mechanism. It's just a reiteration of earlier points. 18 are about nuclear issues. Zaporizhia is split 50-50, assuming all this, though, that Zaporizhia remains in de facto Russian control. And again, Ukraine has no say on that, even though it's energy. 19 around educational programs and intolerance, and Russia's politicized definition of Nazism, and this is worked into Ukraine's constitution. Again, all very pro-Moscow's rhetoric. The core of the plan around the territories, that Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, are all recognized as de facto Russian. Kherson and Zaporizhia are frozen along the current line of contact. Remaining areas, whatever that means, are returned. And Ukrainian forces withdraw from parts of Donetsk, turn it into a demilitarized zone that's still labeled Russian. This is legally incoherent, politically impossible to implement, and unacceptable for Ukraine or Europe. Ultimately, also because right now the Russians control 60 to 70% of Zaporizhia and Kherson, more or less. That's not enough to claim that you control the territory. The Ukrainians have made it very clear through their military responses that they are capable of holding the Russians off. Yes, they're losing in Pokrovsk gradually, but that's just one city. We're talking about 4 massive oblasts where the Russians are not making any headway. Lastly, points 21 to 28 look at provisions including river access, humanitarian exchanges, forced elections in 100 days for Ukraine, full amnesty, Trump chairing some peace council, and immediate ceasefire after withdrawals. Many of these either contradict earlier clauses or simply strip Ukraine of any agency and ignore Europe's more immediate status as being threatened. So this plan is obviously already going to fail, but Zelensky has said he will engage with the Americans. A diplomatic way of saying, let's wait until Russia shows its cards. Russia's reaction has been muted, mainly because it was caught off guard. Colleagues I have in the country told me that no one was really expecting this. They're not rejecting outright because a lot of the elements do favour Moscow, but it's far from what they would like. And the leak has unquestionably annoyed the Kremlin. The Americans are already framing this as one of their many drafts. The truth is that this is not a peace plan. It is a political document intended to create the impression of movement. And in doing so, it risks delaying any genuine ceasefire. Because now both sides will want to amend, object, renegotiate, and contest each point, which means time and time again prolonging the conflict. This is a war of attrition. The advantage of having a draft is that we can finally see the pitfalls clearly. And this is, again, I reiterate, the first American proposal. not coming from the two main combatants involved in this war. Moreover, and as I've said time and again in previous videos, just because you start negotiations does not guarantee anything. For all the pro-Putinists or trolls that exist who follow this account or on X or wherever they sit around the internet, claiming that we just need to get talks going, that yields nothing. You have to ensure that the Ukrainians are on board to agree that they will stop fighting, which if they don't, they won't. And more likely that the Russians will not continue to not fight because or ultimately Putin thinks that if given enough strategic patience, he can outwin the war fatigue that exists in the West, and most specifically the United States. The plan in its current form will not pass. It's too contradictory for Moscow, it's too compromising for Kiev, and it's too legally incoherent for anyone of a reasonable mind, i.e., not the Trump administration. The winter is going to be tough for both sides, and these drafts will continue circulating. The leaks are going to be weaponized, the rhetoric will be ever more polarized and inflamed. How do you negotiate when the proposals demand concessions on territory, sovereignty, and security, the very things Ukraine is fighting to preserve? All that has to change, really. If Putin wanted to genuinely seek some kind of territorial considerations, he could do it through the United Nations. They could hold genuine, internationally recognized referendum on whether these territories want to be part of Ukraine or Russia. If Putin pulled out of Ukraine tomorrow, then this war could stop and things could change. But he's not going to, and therefore Ukraine is not going to stop resisting. But that's lost on many people. Let me know what you guys think. My name is Pyotr Kurzin. I am half English, half Russian, giving me a unique insight onto these matters. I've been to the front lines, and if you found this breakdown useful, do subscribe, give the video a like, it's free, and you can support me further with a coffee or a beer, and become a member on the channel if you so wish. But I'll see you all in the next one. Got some good interviews coming up. Take care.